When imagining the fall of Rome, most people picture barbarian hordes breaking down the gates, legions collapsing, or emperors being poisoned in their marble palaces. However, empires don't just disintegrate from external attacks. They rot from the inside out. And one of the most corrosive forces in this process is, invariably, money. Rome didn't just fall due to invasions or rampant corruption. It fell because its currency collapsed. And the lessons of this financial disaster still apply to all modern economies that believe they can play with money and get away with it. Let's set the stage. For centuries, the backbone of the Roman economy was the silver denarius. First minted around 211 BC, it was composed of nearly pure silver, a reliable currency throughout the empire and beyond its borders. It was the standard payment for the legions, the currency demanded by merchants, and the haven where common people stored their wealth. The denarius wasn't just money, it was trust materialized in metal. The empire's power and the coin's value were intrinsically linked. As long as people believed in Rome, they believed in its money. But running an empire is expensive. Legions needed to be paid, roads and aqueducts built, and wars financed. In the 2nd century AD, Rome was overstretched, defending its borders against Germanic tribes, facing the Parthians in the east, and dealing with internal conflicts. Tax revenues simply couldn't keep up with military costs. That's when the emperors turned to an old trick: debasement. Instead of raising taxes on the citizens, an always unpopular measure, they chose to reduce the silver content in the denarius. The numbers tell this story clearly. Under Emperor Augustus, who ruled at the beginning of the empire, the denarius contained about 95% silver. By the reign of Caracalla in the early 3rd century, that content had dropped to about 50%. By the time of Emperor Gallienus, in the mid-3rd century, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. A coin that was once solid metal had become a bronze disc with a thin silver coating. The people could see and feel the difference. The immediate consequence was inflation. Prices skyrocketed because the money was no longer anchored to real value. A measure of wheat, which once cost a single denarius, suddenly cost dozens. This wasn't an abstract economic theory. It was something that destroyed the lives of ordinary Romans. Soldiers demanded higher wages to cover the rising cost of living. Merchants stopped accepting the debased coins, preferring barter or payments in pure gold. Local economies regressed to direct trade because the currency was no longer trustworthy. And the more trust deteriorated, the more emperors minted cheap coins, hoping that volume would replace value. It was a vicious cycle, the same cycle that has repeated in countless inflationary crises ever since. The crisis reached its peak during the so-called crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome suffered nearly 50 years of absolute chaos: invasions, plagues, civil wars, and economic collapse. Emperors rose and fell at a dizzying speed, sometimes reigning for only a few months, before being assassinated. Behind this political drama was a bankrupt financial system. Taxes were demanded in coins that were worth less and less. Farmers abandoned their lands because they couldn't afford to pay. Trade networks fragmented. The Roman government tried desperate measures, from price controls to forced labor obligations, to keep the system afloat. None of it worked. One emperor, Diocletian, tried to stop the bleeding. In 301 AD, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, fixing the cost of over 1,000 goods and services, from grain to laborers' wages. Violators faced the death penalty. The edict was a complete disaster. Prices couldn't be controlled by decree when the money itself was worthless. The black market exploded, and official trade nearly collapsed. People quickly learned that the law couldn't fix a broken currency. Eventually, Rome abandoned the denarius completely. Constantine the Great introduced the solidus, a gold coin of consistent purity, around 312 AD. It restored some stability and lasted for centuries in the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine Empire. But by then, the Western Empire was already fatally weakened. The debasement of the denarius had hollowed out Rome's economic core. The armies could no longer be sustained. Trade networks had ruptured, and trust had vanished. The fall of Rome was not an isolated event, but a long process of disintegration, and the currency's collapse was one of its sharpest driving threads. What does this mean for us today? It means that the destruction of money is always, invariably, the destruction of empires. Rome believed it could fool its people by issuing coins that looked the same but contained less real value. Modern governments think they can do the same by printing paper, manipulating interest rates, or inflating away debt. But the result is always the same. The people pay the price, wealth is destroyed, and trust collapses. Rome learned this lesson the hard way, and if we ignore it, we will meet the same fate. History didn't stop teaching after Rome. Every great inflationary crisis since has repeated the same pattern. Governments devalue money to cover their costs. Elites protect themselves with real assets, and ordinary people are left with nothing. The Roman monetary crisis is simply the first large-scale example, a blueprint for collapse. Fast-forwarding to the 20th century, the echoes are deafening. After World War I, Germany faced crushing reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. The government printed marks to cover its obligations, thinking it could paper over the debt, just as Rome had minted more coins. By 1923, hyperinflation was out of control. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark before the war came to cost over 200 billion marks by the autumn of that year. People carried their wages home in wheelbarrows. Retirees starved as their savings evaporated. And, just as in Rome, those with debts saw them decimated by inflation, while those with real assets, land, factories, foreign currency, emerged stronger. Money became meaningless, and the economic desperation fueled the political extremism that set the stage for Hitler's rise. Zimbabwe followed the same path in the early 2000s. Facing land seizures, falling production, and rising debts, the government turned to the printing press. In 2008, inflation reached a mind-boggling level, an annual rate of 89.7 sextillion%. Prices were doubling every day. Stores couldn't change their price tags fast enough. Eventually, Zimbabwe abandoned its currency entirely, forcing citizens to trade in US dollars or South African rands. Once again, a government thought it could cheat reality. Once again, the people paid the price. But you don't have to look only at the extremes. Even in modern developed economies, the Roman pattern persists. Consider the United States. In 1971, President Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, severing the last link between the currency and a tangible anchor. From that moment on, the dollar became what economists call fiat currency, backed not by gold, but only by faith in the government. And just like in Rome, the temptation to spend beyond its means became irresistible. In the following decades, debt soared, the money supply expanded, and inflation became a constant. While we haven't seen wheelbarrows full of cash, we have witnessed a steady erosion of purchasing power. $1 in 1971 could buy what costs over $6 today. The coins look the same. The bills look the same. But the value has been hollowed out. The trick is always the same. Governments disguise inflation as growth. They tell citizens that higher wages mean prosperity, even as costs rise faster. They present debt as investment, even when it only finances consumption. They point to rising stock markets as proof of wealth, even when most of the population owns few or no stocks. Just like the Roman emperors, they pretend that nothing fundamental has changed, while silently extracting value from every coin, every bill, every paycheck. What makes the current scenario dangerous is the global scale. Rome's collapse was an imperial crisis. Weimar's hyperinflation was national. Zimbabwe's was local. But today, the entire world runs on fiat currencies, massive debts, and central banks willing to print trillions at the first sign of a crisis. This means the next collapse won't be confined to a single empire or country. It will spread across the entire globe. And if history is any guide, the ones who will suffer won't be the elites' holdings, assets, but the millions who depend on salaries, pensions, and savings denominated in increasingly fragile currencies. So, what should you, as an individual, learn from Rome's monetary crisis? First, understand that inflation is not an accident. It is policy. It is the silent tax that has been breaking empires for 2,000 years. Second, realize that true wealth isn't found in paper or numbers, on a screen, but in assets that hold value when money doesn't. Land, skills, productive businesses, resources. Third, never assume that stability is permanent. Romans in the 1st century would have laughed if they knew their coins would one day be worthless. Germans in 1913 would have scoffed at the idea of wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread. Zimbabweans in the 1980s thought their independence promised eternal prosperity. Yet, in each case, the same story unfolded. The fall of Rome reminds us that financial systems can collapse slowly, then all at once, as trust evaporates. When money ceases to be real, society itself begins to unravel. Contracts fail, trade breaks down, armies dissolve, and governments lose legitimacy. The barbarians at the gate might finish the job, but the real killer is always inside the treasury. And here's the cosmic joke. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. The Roman monetary crisis wasn't just about bad emperors or greedy elites. It was about the fragility of money itself when abused by power, and that fragility has never gone away. If this gave you a new perspective, click subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.